Hey friends, welcome to Bokeh, a podcast exploring the ever-blurring lines between the personal and business lives of professional photographers. This is your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm happy that you can join me in connecting with photographers and entrepreneurs as we discuss photography, business, and that sometimes messy thing we call life. This podcast is brought to you by Milu, the simplest way for photographers and coordinators to collaborate on shot lists and timelines for weddings, parties, and other amazing events. Visit Milu, MIILU.com. This podcast is also brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the professional photographer. Visit photographersedit.com. All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back for another Bokeh Podcast episode, and I'm here with Leslie. You feel like in some ways kind of a longtime friend just because the connection has been great. Our conversation even before I started recording is great. We had a great opportunity to connect in person at least once, maybe twice now. Thank you so much for making time for the Bokeh Podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm honored to be on your illustrious podcast.
Well, and I say this and people think, well, it's probably he just says this thing and he feeds people lines, but I truly feel like it's a privilege to have you as an individual, you specifically on the podcast. One of the things that immediately just kind of drew me in and made me want to have you on the show is your photography, your black and white photography specifically. And we're actually going to talk about that today, documentary family photography, which is something that you specialize in, but it is so engaging. And,
thank you.
Well, and not only that, you have the most beautiful family. I mean, your husband
Aww.
is extremely handsome. Your kids are just adorable. And some of these pictures that you post of you guys are just, it's so beautiful. So that really grabbed my attention
Thank
too.
You so much.
No, absolutely.
I like them as well. I think they're kind of cute. I think I'll keep them.
And what's your husband's name?
My husband's name is Aaron.
Aaron. Okay, so how long have you and Aaron been together?
We have been together 12 years in January.
Okay, awesome.
Been married 12 years in January. We've known each other since we were 21, and I am 36.
Wow. Okay, so I have to ask you, how did you meet?
So we met actually through our best friends, which was really cool.
Okay.
My best friend and I were roommates in college. She was dating this guy at the time, and so he asked, I think she went to my husband's house. They went over there to meet Aaron, and he asked if she had any friends, and she said, yes, I have my roommate. Like, would you guys like to meet? And then he loves to tell the story because I said, I don't want to meet, his friend. Like, I'm not interested. And he came anyway, and we went to the movies, and we continued to date, and they didn't. She's happily married now with 2 kids to her husband. But we stayed connected.
Yeah.
So that's how we met, through our best friends.
I look at this picture, and there's actually this podcast episode will air in the next 3-4 weeks or so. But there's your most recent post on your personal Instagram, which is Leslie Leslie Kershaw KERSHAW for everybody listening in. We'll link to this in the show notes too. But there's this picture that you posted most recently, September 29th, of your whole family together. It looks like one just big selfie trying to get everybody in the picture. But that picture of your husband, he just looks like the most genuinely kind individual. Like you want to sit down, have a drink, and have a conversation with him.
Nathan, let me just tell you, you would love him. He's a big talker.
Yeah.
You guys would get to talking and you'd have a great conversation. So we have to make sure that we make that happen one day.
Oh, I would absolutely love that. And I was actually telling you before we started recording that I have a second podcast. It's been kind of set aside for the time being just with limited time, but it's specifically about relationships. We might have to have you on that podcast as well, just because I'd be curious to dig into that.
Be on that podcast. We love to talk about relationships and how we aim to have a kind of respectful relationship, and why it's very important for us to both honestly express ourselves, and just I think relationships is just all like, it just starts with respect, and so we both respect each other, show a lot of high regard and respect for one another. And I think that's why we have such a great relationship.
That's huge. I mean, we could literally stop the podcast episode now and just end on that note, because it is, and I think it maybe for some, it would take a little bit. They'd be like, well, yeah, of course they start with respect and then they just move on. But the reality is that holds really, really deep meaning. I've certainly realized it more in recent years. I was previously married and have since learned a lot about relationships since my ex and I split. And I'm now in a relationship with a wonderful woman named Jill. And I've continued to learn more about the significance of respect. It really does. So much of the relationship, the root of the relationship has to be there in respect, rooted in respect.
Absolutely. And it's definitely a choice. It's a choice you have to make in every encounter, it's a choice that you make. And so that's why I think it's so important because, you can have all of the other things, but if you don't have that initial level of respect, things can go, AWOL very quickly.
Well, and it holds true across the board. Conversations and all types of relationships with all types of people, it absolutely has to start with respect. And man, that's probably like 3 or 4 or 5 podcast episodes worth of conversation just right there.
Absolutely.
But, well, we'll leave that for another day. But let's go ahead and get into what is kind of our normal outline, at least at the first part of it. And we normally talk about this idea of brand position. Now, first of all, just to give a little bit of context to you and your business, what market are you based in currently?
Washington, D.C., and I'm a family photographer.
Okay, cool. So family photographer, Washington, D.C. Now, from what I understand, the D.C. market is pretty full of photographers. There are a lot of photographers in that area, wedding photographers, portrait photographers, or otherwise. Particularly wedding photographers, it seems as though I've heard there are quite a few there. But regardless, you've got to figure out how to stand out amidst the crowd of photographers. And so we talk about the significance of brand position, which is really just a unique value proposition, right? If somebody knows about Leslie Kershaw photography, what should happen is this kind of idea pops into their head immediately. Oh, she's the photographer that, fill in the blank. So what would that line be that should come to their mind?
So my kind of like brand positioning is that I capture the soul of everyday family life.
Interesting. Okay, so talk to me about soul, because I know this is a word that you hear in culture a decent amount, but it can be a bit subjective in meaning. What does that mean to you?
Absolutely. So, soul to me is just kind of like the essence of, what your family is, and I think that's kind of like what documentary photography is all about, like capturing who you are, and that's very individual. So, what might be, soulful for one family isn't going to be soulful for the next family. And so like I work really hard to make sure that, not that other people see the uniqueness in a family, but that they see their uniqueness when they get the images back.
Huh. Okay.
Because I think that that's also subjective. Like, everybody, feels like they're unique. And I think that you don't always, to the viewer, you may not always see like why something is special and unique to them, but they can look at the images and see, and, so it's, the images are for them. The images are for, their generational historical images to keep and to, refer back to and to, spark memories and just kind of, remember, a place and time. That's one of the, I will talk about this later, but that's one of the, reasons why, I choose to shoot this way is because, I feel like I don't have the best memory of my childhood. And it's really important for me to, document that for my kids, so they can see it, but also for myself, so I can remember.
Well, but there's something interesting. I'm actually on the homepage of your website currently. And again, for those of you listening in, Leslie Kershaw, LeslieKershaw.com. And again, we'll link to that in the show notes as well. But there's this picture of who I'm assuming is your husband with one of your children. Is that right?
Yes. Which picture is it?
It actually,
there's a lot of those.
It looks like the shadows of the blinds are kind of running across his back.
Yes.
And what I was going to say is it's you've done such a beautiful job there of not only capturing the so-called soul of your family life, but have done so in an artistic way. And if you can do both at the same time, it's just stunning. And this seems to be something that you have a knack for. So I have to give you props for that. But
oh, thank you.
Oh, 100%. No, and 100% mean it too. But in that market, I'm sure there are other photographers who might label themselves documentary photographers. So how do you effectively communicate the difference between yourself, a documentary family photographer, and others who might claim that same title? What's the differentiation factor, and how do you communicate that?
One thing is that I've stopped doing that. I feel like, my work with my own family is purely documentary. And the work that I do with other families, depending on like what they want, need, like, their personality, it can be a mix, so it can be a mixed bag. But, in my heart, I would, truly wish to, photograph them completely documentary. But I do like to be very respectful of the standards of what documentary photography is and what, photojournalism is. It's no manipulation of the scene, of the image. There's no coaching. There's strictly. So I don't necessarily position myself that way to clients, but I'd like to position myself to them as a storytelling photographer. So like, all photographers, tell stories. I mean, that's basically our job. But I think for people who are like new to the genre, I think that's the best word to use for them to understand that, I'm here to take lots of images and hopefully create a story of, our day, our time together of this moment.
Well, and we're going to actually get into that process, or at least the thought process behind how you go about documentary family photography in just a bit. So we'll come back to this conversation, but let me keep moving. How long have you been in business for yourself as a photographer?
I have been in business 4 years. 4
years. Okay. So relatively new to the game. I'm curious though, in that time frame, what's been one of the most significant lessons that you've learned as a photography business owner? To
not get stuck in fear. Like, fear of like the unknown, fear to try something new, fear to like, make connections, fear to try to like niche when being a business owner, like in my heart, I'm more of a creative, and some of, the business decisions, like, that you have to make, they cost money, they cost time, they cost quality of life sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
And so you just kind of have to decide how far you want to go with it. I personally am a part-time photographer. I still work full-time. So it allows me a little bit of, flexibility to, be creative and to have like a unique, proposition where, I don't necessarily have to, I can make a goal of how much money I want to make and, how much, I shoot, but it's not, my livelihood isn't 100% attached to taking photographs.
Okay.
And I think that allows me to have a little bit more flexibility than some photographers have.
Yeah, that is an ideal place to be in, where you're not solely reliant on the income from the business. So it gives you a bit of flexibility to figure things out, and to also be selective in the clients that you take on, because you don't absolutely have to have that next, whatever it is, the portrait session or event or otherwise, in order to make ends meet. That is a really ideal, in some ways, an ideal place to be in, and probably some photographers would be a bit envious of you. But I'm curious though, when you talk about this idea of fear. You and I were actually having a brief conversation about psychology before we started recording. I find it fascinating on multiple levels, but this idea of fear is largely based in assumptions about the future, right? And many times those assumptions are projections on the situation based on, again, assumptions regarding that particular issue, that particular scenario, or otherwise. So I'm curious how you've been able to kind of step beyond those so-called assumptions and overcome the fears and make the moves that you need to for your business.
I think you have to stay present, and you need to, set strategic goals. That was like another thing that we talked about. I think if you are allowing the decisions you make in your business to be based on things that you see other people are doing, and, it's, you haven't, kind of sat with yourself and said, okay, what are the strategic decisions or like goals that I have, for my own business, for my own life, like, what does that mean? And, I think a lot of times, when we're fearful, we may not be, acting in, well, it's a mix, because like most of the time when we're fearful, we should be, that's if we're scared of something, then we should be doing it. But also the other side of that is that sometimes, we fear the unknown, so like you have to learn about it. You have to like be willing to kind of just take the time and, sit with it and actually learn it so that it doesn't scare you anymore.
Isn't that interesting? It's a lot of it is just about education and awareness at the end of the day, because again, that fear so many times, and I speak from personal experience, that fear so many times is a projection, an assumption. Well, because this happened, or I heard this person say this thing, then this must be what is going to happen. And now I'm just going to project a sense of fear on this particular scenario, when the reality is I don't know what it's actually like to be in that situation. I don't know where this other person who told me this thing could be scary or otherwise, where they got that information, and if that was just a one-off experience or if that holds true for 1,000 other people. I mean, there's so many potential variables there to consider. The other thing about fear that I find interesting, if you just scroll through Facebook these days or Instagram or otherwise, people are talking about how they are highly anxious or something related to fear, that they're fearful of this thing or fearful of that. And I think we've in some ways gotten kind of a distorted perspective in 2019 American culture about what is actually something that should be causing us to kind of go into fight or flight mode. For whatever reason, and I don't know where this originally came from, but I tend to go to a soldier in battle and the incredible amount of potential fear they must face if they've got a gun pointed at them, or they're running into a place where bombs are being dropped, whatever the case may be. But that's truly life-threatening. When we talk about anxiety, that's going to cause a level of anxiety potentially that could just be almost unsurmountable, a level of fear that only a few of us, percentage-wise, of our population actually know what it's like. And so I wonder, too, if we need to gain a little bit of a fresher perspective on what we should be giving so much significance to in the context of fear. Do you think that we too easily get afraid of something these days, when the reality is in some cases we just need to make a move, see what happens, course correct if need be, and it's really not as big of a deal as we make it in our minds?
I think that the mind is very tricky, because for some people who suffer with those feelings of anxiety, it literally feels that way.
Sure.
And it feels really, kind of just starting feels, debilitating, and they get those feelings. I think that it's really hard to I'm the type of person who tries not to project or put myself in a place of what someone else is thinking.
Sure.
But I do feel like I get what you're saying, and I agree to an extent. I just think that we need to be more kind, to ourselves, and to not try to do, all of the things. I mean, sometimes the anxiety that we might be feeling or facing, I think for me personally is, an expectation of how, something should play out, So it's really about releasing that expectation of how something should be. And so that kind of goes back to the, staying present, staying in the moment, not, thinking about past, not thinking about future, but, really trying to ground yourself and stay present. Okay, so, if my mind starts to go into future, then that's building the anxiety. But if I can kind of come back to the present and say, okay, but what am I doing now? What can I do to take one step to make this better? I think that really is the thing. We just kind of have to release some of the expectations on ourselves and
that.
On what we were supposed to do versus what we are actually doing right now.
Well, and I just want to be very clear about one thing, and that is, I didn't mean to minimize the significance of anyone's feelings per se. I went through a pretty dark place after my ex and I split, and there were probably a good 2 or 3 years or so, maybe even longer really, where I pulled back from the photography industry, which I had been such a significant part of, such a close part of as a photographer, speaking from stage, connecting with photographers, trying to help them with their business. And I kind of pulled back. And part of that, and I look back now, and it took me so much time to come out of this place where really I was just kind of in my own head, in my own feelings, focused on my feelings. And it was me. And that ultimately held me back from growing as quickly as I could have, or as making a change in my life as quickly as I could have, because I was just kind of fixated, not just on my feelings, but the kind of underlying issue with our feelings many times, and you alluded to this actually when you were talking about expectations, is the way that we frame a situation. It's the story that we tell ourselves about that particular scenario. And so when I talk about perspective, when I was talking about perspective earlier, I didn't mean to minimize the significance of our feelings, anybody's feelings at the end of the day. But what I'm suggesting is that, and I'm going to go back to your point, we need to frame the situation in a bit of a different way. If it's an expectation that we're projecting on the situation, and we realize that changing that expectation can change the way that we feel, that's incredible, because that indicates self-awareness. And now we're taking responsibility for our feelings versus just kind of saying, this thing happened to me and I'm freaked out and I'm just not going to do it. There's self-awareness that drives our behavior. And I love that you highlight that. I think that's beautiful.
Absolutely. And I can tell you are a meditator, because this, idea of focusing just on self really kind of boxes you in. It really boxes you in, because you're just like, well, me. I'm the only one who's going through this. I'm the only one, who has these problems.
Yeah.
And, if you can step back and, kind of think about other people and, how other people might, be affected. And like you said, your war scenario, I'm not having to do that right now. I literally just have to take the next step. So, there's
a phrase that I use with my kids to their annoyance, I think at times, because I've used it so much, but I always throw out that kind of cliche phrase, first world problems. And I do it kind of jokingly in a way, but it also helps me maintain perspective too, that when this thing that I'm maybe making too big of a deal, I realize when I compare that to situations, scenarios, a life that so many people elsewhere may be facing that is so much more difficult, so much that would naturally cause so much more anxiety or fear, or at the end of the day, hunger, sadly, or whatever the case. I've got it made. I've got it beyond made. And so the idea that I would put so much significance on this and feel sorry for myself or be so upset, I need to change. Again, I need to reframe this. I need to change my perspective. And I do this with my kids too, just because I want them to also realize there is a tendency, again, in our culture these days, we just tend to blow everything up. And it's easy to do that when you have food and shelter and don't have to worry about having the next meal on the table, whatever the case. It's easy to then start to fixate on other things that really shouldn't carry so much significance. If we can maintain perspective about how much we have, I think that'll shift our perspective a little bit about the significance that we give to these individual situations. Maybe we don't blow them up as much, and then as a result, they don't hold us back personally or professionally to the extent that they maybe could. So again, another loaded topic. And by the way, I really appreciate your empathy, because I know I'm being a little bit more straightforward, and we really do have to kind of consider everybody's perspective, and that's a loaded conversation in of itself. But I love your empathetic approach to this. At the end of the day, to your point again, thinking about how we're framing the situation is really important, and I think we should all keep that in mind, both personally and professionally. But let's keep going. I want to talk about time, because you've got a family and a business. Trying to do both at the same time. That's a lot to juggle. How do you, and then we talked about meditation earlier, and I do love meditation, and on multiple levels. How do you make time for yourself, for your family, to stay healthy personally, to keep relationships healthy within your family and with friends as well, while simultaneously running your business? Do you have a particular workflow tip or trick that you can recommend?
So I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. I definitely, try to live my life mindfully.
Okay.
And, so I strive to be more mindful in everything that I do. So, when it comes to my business, when it comes to work, when it comes to, balancing family life. And I also try to, really, know what my priorities are. I think a lot of times we can feel overwhelmed with life when we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. And I'm not the best at this. Obviously, I have a shift. I have to reset sometimes. I forget, I don't have good boundaries around, some things. I say yes to things that I shouldn't. And then, I get upset because I'm overwhelmed. So I do read a lot of productivity books, and I try to, take things from, every place. So this this past maybe like 6 months, I read 3 habit books.
Really?
And yeah, so it was, I'm going to mess up the titles, so I'm not even going to talk about them. But some, I read Atomic Habits. That was one of them.
Okay.
I think another one was called The Now Habit. And then the other one is that Science of Habits book.
Okay.
And so I just tried to, like, keep myself informed, and I'm always tweaking my productivity and the things that I try all the time. But I think you definitely should stick to one thing first and see if it actually works. For me, it's having like a really solid morning routine where like, I make sure that, I have some time for myself in the morning, kind of creating a list of who are my priority people, so that that's something that I can like look back to. So if someone else asks me to do something, they're not like one of my priority people, like I need to be able to say, okay, no, I can't do that. And kind of the same thing for my business, a checklist. You have to keep reminding yourself, like, is this aligned with those priorities that I have for my life and my business?
And this is another point on which we could just end the podcast episode, because if all of our listeners literally took that one idea where they have a clear understanding of what their goals, bigger picture goals are personally, and of course that then affects what you do professionally, that would literally enable them. You and I were talking about this before recording. That would enable them to filter out the stuff that's irrelevant. And the amount of time that you would save just implementing that in your business consistently would be mind-blowing. So I'm glad that you highlight that. But it's
very hard to do because, we have so many other influences. We see, I'm often triggered by something else someone else is doing. And I find myself shifting, and then I have to like reset and say, why am I doing this? Like, this wasn't even a plan or priority, but I went on Instagram or I went on Facebook and I saw this idea. And it's someone who, always, I work full time in marketing. So we're always coming up with ideas and like, oh, maybe I could try that. And it's just like, no, like I have to stay the course. Like I can't try to implement something new right now.
I don't want to get too far down this road, but I am curious, being in marketing, and what type of marketing are you involved in?
I work for an association, a pharmacist association.
Okay. So in that marketing world, I mean, I'm sure you've learned quite a bit about this idea of marketing, and it is such a broad topic, I realize. But when you take what you've learned being involved in marketing and then you come back to the photography world, whether you're looking at Instagram accounts or websites or otherwise, are there any things, even just one thing that might pop into your head that you think that photographers at large might be able to do a little bit more effectively if they implement a particular principle that you've seen work in the field that you're working in?
I think just this, idea of being a really authentic storyteller. That's kind of the trend with marketing in general. Like, we just all need to be able to like tell stories better. And if you can, kind of, so there's this is a mixed bag. I'm new to marketing per se.
Okay.
My first kind of career is in websites, and that has transitioned into like, UX, which is, also transitioned into marketing and customer. And so I just always try to think about, my customer first, like really put myself in the mind of my customer, like researching, them, like knowing like what they want. And then also releasing the expectation that, I have to be the perfect person for everyone, like I know that, there are plenty of people out there who, are fine marketing to everyone, but I really try to, hyper focus my target audience and, just stick to them. And so I think that that's scary for people to do because they say, oh, well, I'm missing out on all of these other leads and people. But like, if you're talking to everyone, you're essentially kind of like talking to not one person, and you want to be speaking directly to one person and being able to tell your brand story to them.
That's good. Yeah. And brand story, it reminds me of a book, Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, which is one of the most...
I need to read that.
Oh, man, I can't recommend it enough, especially around this topic of doing the very thing you were talking about, telling a story. I haven't read very many business books that were not, like 80% fluff and just a few pages of actually good content. This book was incredible. The amount of great, practical, actionable content in it, and just extremely poignant. I mean, to the extent that I use Evernote to keep track of documents, notes, etc. And at this point, I think I have over 12,000 documents in there. But it's one of literally, I know I'm a total dork, but there's a section called favorites where you can favorite certain notes. And I have literally favorited the notes that I took from that book as one of the, of the thousands of documents in there, one of the few that are on this favorites list, the notes from that book. It was just so incredibly powerful. So I can't recommend enough for everybody listening in. And you know what, Leslie, I'm going to have to send you a copy of it too, because it's just really, really that good. But what I want to do is we're going to link to those books that you mentioned earlier. Make sure that those who are curious about this idea of developing habits, if you're curious to explore that, you'll be able to find those books in the show notes. We just talked about building a story brand, but this is really kind of a good segue to my next question about the most impactful business or self-help book that you've read. Are there others that come to mind, one or two in particular?
So the one that I think kind of started me on a different kind of mindset journey about creativity is Big Magic.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And, that was kind of like the first book that I read that had me thinking differently about creativity. I struggled with, calling myself a creative for so long. And so books like that and also The Artist's Way, like really helped me see that, so many things, all the things that we do are creative. And so I just really, enjoyed the perspective of that book. That book also talks a lot about kind of pushing through fear. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was probably the first book that I read, maybe right when I got serious about my business. It really kind of shifted, the way I think about creativity and being so personal. And, how can I be true to my own creativity and still serve my clients, So
The Artist's Way, I'm going to actually we'll link to The Artist's Way. That's Julia Cameron. And then the other that you'd mentioned was Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. We'll link to these in the show notes for everybody curious as well. Big Magic is definitely a book that's come up on the show. Sounds like a popular one. I haven't personally read it yet, but that sounds quite compelling. So we'll link to that in the show notes. And for those of you listening in, show notes, if you go to bokehpodcast.com, you can find them there under each episode. You can also see the show notes in the podcast app that you're using. If it has show notes, you just go to that section and you'll see the links to the resources, the books, the websites, the social media, etc. There in the show notes, as well as the talking points from our discussion. So make sure to take advantage of that. Let's jump into, and I love our wide-ranging discussion. This has been really nice, Leslie, but let me actually get back to your style of documentary photography, documentary family photography specifically, because truly, and to be frank, it doesn't happen really very often these days. I mean, I've been in the industry close to 20 years, and you see so much of the same thing over and over and over and over again. I'm quite taken by your photography, your photographic style, and it's quite interesting to me that you've only been in business for 4 years, despite having the skill set with work that actually stands out. How did you develop the style?
Thank you so much. You're so kind. So first, I would say that my style is still developing because, I still consider myself a very new photographer. Okay. So it's developing, it's evolving, but I think we talked a little bit, I don't know if this was, in our conversation in the podcast or before, but like me having this, I wanted to be able, mom tog, I wanted to be able to take great photos of my children. And I've always, I said this in, I think, a bio that I eventually took it out, but, that corny, I've always been a photographer at heart, but I have, I've always loved pictures. I've always looked, when, in my life previously, before I was a photographer, I would look at other photographers and I would be jealous and be like, oh, they're so lucky to have that great skill, not knowing that, my entire life I've been dissecting photographs. I really used to be into fashion. And so I was really into fashion photography. And that was my favorite thing. Okay. But when I, had my first son, Zali, who's 8 now, I really wanted to be able to take great images of him. But at the same time, I wasn't interested in the pose pictures. I'm I don't remember a lot of, parts of my life. So I really want to be able to document, his childhood. And I also didn't want my family to kind of be resentful of, this new passion that I had, because I think a lot of times, it's just it turns into a burden for everyone because it's oh, I'm basically using you as my prop
Yep.
while I learn,
Yep.
so I didn't want it to turn into something like that. I wanted them to appreciate, what I did, because I saw it as, like a creative outlet. And, maybe if they wanted, if they were interested in photography later, I wanted to make sure that it was something that we could all, appreciate and use later. And so I think that's how, this style developed. And then I started researching this, idea of documentary photography, family photography. And I, started to find some lifestyle stuff, and I started to find some documentary stuff. And I was like, yes, that's it. And from there, I just kind of dove into, work, composition and, just learning my camera very well. Yeah. And then using my phone too. I will say, I know a lot of people are like, oh, wow, your phone. But my phone taught me so much about, kind of like capturing organic moments and starting off with editing.
Yeah. And people can say what they want to about the phones. Like, we're at a place now, I have an iPhone 11 Pro. There is no, there's no room for criticism, really. I mean, these things are absolutely amazing for what they are. I mean, I don't expect it to take the same thing that a $5,000 DSLR will. That's not the point. The point is you can take a beautiful image with these phones. And like you said, it's a great platform to practice on.
Right. And in fact, that image that you just called out on my homepage, that was a phone image.
Are you serious? And that thing won an award too, didn't it?
It did. So, I mean, I really enjoy using my phone. I think it kind of, especially maybe for the work that I do too, I think it's less intrusive. I need to eventually invest in a mirrorless camera on my list, but
I that's just, it kind of has me speechless, because I'm thinking, you know what, this very much proves, I mean, and this is again another very loaded topic, but it just proves my point that the fact that you can take an image that just is so absolutely stunning, and it's on, for those of you listening in, do go to lesliekershaw.com, but then on your Instagram, your personal Instagram, Leslie Kershaw, it's on the August 3rd, it's an August 3rd post, and you talk about winning the award with it, but it's just an absolutely stunning image. And the fact that you shot that with your phone, I don't know how people can downplay the significance of the phone. And of course, what that means too, on a very much bigger picture level for us as photographers, and what we need to think about in relation to what consumers can do compared to what we can do. But nonetheless, stunning image, and you all have to make sure you check that out.
Thank you.
100%. Well, but talk to me about the black and white though too, and even that image that you shot on the phone. It's got this particular feel about it. Are you, first of all, what has drawn you to black and white, and then, if you wouldn't mind sharing, what is the process that you go through to apply that particular black and white look to your images?
I didn't realize that I was going to be a black and white junkie. When I started, I shot all in color, but I started to notice some, a theme in my images, like this, that I really loved, this intersection between light and shadow. And when I started, working to process the images, I noticed that, in processing it, when you're able to really capture light well, it really, really is very impactful, in black and white. And so now I kind of shoot an image and I know immediately, how I'm going to convert it. I know that it's going to be a black and white image.
Yeah.
And so as I started to research, why black and white photography and, zoning. And I just was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of crazy the way that, the old school photographers, they only shot in black and white, and how they had to use this unique system when shooting film, in zones with, how to make sure that, shadows and highlights were, appropriately exposed for.
Right.
I'm nerding out on black and white now, but
good old Ansel Adams zone system, right?
Yeah, exactly. I just think that there's a lot of science to it. I love how it's, super technical. And, for me, I think shooting moments, it just really kind of allows me to get to the nitty gritty, of the moment.
Yep.
And so that's why I love, black and white.
I think you make a great point. It really does tend to take out what can at times be distractions in a color image. Mm-hmm. You go black and white, and now it enables the viewer to focus a little bit more effectively, in some cases much more effectively, on the subject or subjects in the image. And I love black and white for that. People give me a hard time, or not a hard time in a bad way, but kind of laughingly give me a hard time about the amount that I posted.
I love your selfie
in black and white.
montages in black and white. Yeah, so good.
It's kind of a funny thing, or it's turned into kind of a funny thing now. But I'm really taken by your work. Is there a particular process that you're using for black and white, or is it just like a simple grayscale conversion and bump the contrast? Like what's the process you go about?
I do. I have a preset that I've created on both, mobile and in Lightroom.
Okay.
And so, I normally use that preset. I have two of them. One of them I created and I started using it a lot for my personal work. I stopped using it as much, but it kind of has like this redness to it. And I really enjoyed using that one for a while because I really felt like it added some warmth to the black and white images. So I always add a little bit, of red in the shadows just because, I think sometimes, black and white can seem very cool and stark.
Yeah. And
I do want to bring this, feeling of warmth to the black and white. So that has been, like effective for me in like portraying, not only the moment, but like, warmth of moments. Because a lot of my moments I feel like are more warm and, joyful and kind of soulful. So
yeah, I'm actually looking at a picture of this is again on your personal Instagram account, Leslie Kershaw, November 27th, 2018. So just about a year ago. There's a picture you posted of you with two of your boys. And
that's my favorite.
Oh, I mean, first of all,
another phone picture.
Is it really another phone picture? See, that's just incredible. But the range of tonality in that image with that black and white preset that you've created is really incredible. You should probably go ahead and just like get a Shopify store up there and put the presets up for sale because you're going to be getting people emailing you, messaging you for that preset. It's really beautifully done. And so make sure for those of you listening in, you go check out how these have been being processed. It's a beautiful example of black and white photography, Leslie Kershaw. And then I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but your photography account, Leslie Kershaw Photo, and we'll link to both of those in the show notes. But let's get to the ideas, kind of the big ideas. I love focusing first on principles and philosophies that drive what we do. We can, the nitty gritty and the how to and what button do you push and what are the settings, like that carries some significance too. But the philosophy that drives it, I think, carries even more significance. I'm curious what drives your ability as a documentary family photographer. Can you share some of those ideas?
Yeah, so the first two are kind of like combined, and I would say, mindfulness and intentionality, kind of go hand in hand for me, like, being very present, with where I am. And I think that actually shooting my family this way has, this is really corny, but like made our relationship better because like I'm noticing things, I'm being intentional about like, I don't know if you guys follow Kirsten Lewis, but I've looked at a lot of her workshops and she kind of has this, idea that, if you miss something, like a lot of times we repeat our habits, and that has been something that's like been so joyful in me in my photography journey with photographing my family.
Okay.
Is that, like I might miss something, but it's going to happen again.
That's
and
funny,
so
yeah.
I get to, especially with kids, they repeat their behaviors. My husband, like we all have these things
True.
About us that we don't even realize that we're doing, but we repeat it over and over again.
Yep.
And so you have to, I learned this, when shooting documentary that you have to be present to be able to recognize that. And you have to be intentional about capturing it next time and, looking for those cues. So those are two things that with your family, can actually, improve, the relationships that you have with your kids and improve the relationship you have with your partner by staying present and recognizing these gestures and things that make them unique. And I think that it's made my personal work, obviously, a lot stronger than some of the client work I do because I get to be around my family all the time. And I know, I'm very used to them. I know, their habits. I know their quirks. I know the things that they're going to do with their hands. I know the things that they're going to say. I know the things that is going to make them laugh and elicit a certain response.
Yeah.
So.
It's that the significance of presence in a world where we're so easily distracted. It's an interesting skill set that maybe newer photographers will have to put a bit more effort into because it is, when we can just pick up our phone and scroll endlessly for the next whatever stimulating thing visually or otherwise on Instagram, Facebook, etc. And then, there's a TV show that we can binge watch a season of episodes on Netflix, and then we can go do this thing and that thing. And we don't have to many times work to be present. We can just do whatever, whenever. And
oh my goodness. So Nathan, my husband and I were just talking about this with our oldest son, because he, kids these days, they're so used to instant gratification.
Yeah.
So my husband is really into mixed martial arts. And so he's kind of passed that down to my kids. They're taking judo.
Wow.
And so he, my oldest is like, yes, I'm going to be a fighter. I'm going to be a champion. And I'm like, oh, that's great. But then time to practice, he's like, I don't want to practice.
Yeah.
I don't want to do the work,
right.
And so it's you have to do the work too. You're not going to just be able to get to this end result. I think that's sometimes what, kind of seeing all these images, we just get to see people's final result, but we don't get to see the work, behind what they're putting in to do something. And so, for our kids, it's just they're like, oh, you just, you sign up for judo and then you're a champion. It's just no, that's not what happens.
You got to put the work in, and you have to actually to focus too. I mean, that is a, again, there's a cultural conversation around this idea of being ADD or ADHD. And there may be some cases that are particularly extreme that need some type of medical treatment, but I think many cases are more just a symptom of behavioral patterns that have led to a seeming lack of ability to be able to focus. And again, when we have this instant gratification where we can look this way and that and have something stimulating immediately all the time, you tend to lose the ability to be present, to be focused, to look at the person in the eye, to pay attention, to go back to your original point, the nuances, the details of what's going on in front of you, and be ready to capture that. It's really important to not only learn the significance of that, but to develop the skill set, which is paying attention, and then to do so on an ongoing basis. So the mindfulness, and you said the second word was it intentionality?
Yes. And I'm not perfect at this, that's why I said, I think my style is still developing. My being able to do this is very hard. It's hard to do because of all those things that we just listed.
Yeah.
I'm still easily distracted, and sometimes I'm not paying attention.
But you got to be intentional.
It's a struggle.
Like
you have to be intentional.
Yeah, it goes hand in hand. All right, so those are a couple of pretty important ideas, especially when it comes to this notion of documentary photography. If you do want to capture the in-between, the nuanced details, you have to be mindful and intentional in that way. What's another big idea?
So the other one is just, and kind of simple one, but it's just the principle of, creativity. I want to, in my definition of creativity in our household is just to be, to honestly express yourself. So how can I, honestly express my true self, through my work? And, how can I bring the things that, that are special to me, that see the way that I see the world, into my creativity, and so one of those themes is how I notice that, I love, light and shadow. And so that might be a reason, that might be something that sets, my images apart, because I really enjoy that intersection. And I enjoy finding that intersection, in everyday life, where, at what moments can I find that? And that's something that I'm always going to be oh, I have to photograph this. Now I know that's what I want to photograph, because, that's something that is very, impactful to me, in my creative process. And, I'm already thinking about, okay, how am I going to edit and process it? And, it's going to be very moody and, result in something that, kind of seems soulful.
Well, but that's good though. I mean, it's, we were talking about distraction that comes from Instagram. Part of that so-called distraction is by, and you alluded to this earlier as well, noticing other people's work or things that they are doing in their work, their business, maybe their photography, and saying, oh, that looks cool. Let me try that. Oh, that looks cool. Let me try that. And at the end of the day, talk about anxiety. We develop this anxiety, which is I'm trying to do all these things and I can't. And now I'm confused about what it is that I'm even doing with my own work. And so focusing on the thing that you enjoy and letting that come through in your work, letting that show through as your own approach to creativity, I think it's a simple idea and yet so poignant too, and it'll enable us to create work that kind of stands out as our own. I think it's a really great idea.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I have a, high principle of being an individual, having my own unique voice. And also, like, for my clients, I bring that into my business. I talk to them all the time about how, like, this is your unique life. It's different from everyone else's. So please don't look at, someone else's photos, say, oh, this is what I want. Or don't even look at, my photos and say, this is what I want, because I might not be able to give that to you, but I can come and try to display your unique, perspective with, how you interact with your family. And I think that's more important.
When we're talking about the idea of so mindfulness, intentionality, and then this third idea of letting, how would you sum it up best? Letting your creativity or your own creative voice shine through. That sounds so cliche these days because I know that idea of the voice is used so much. But is that how you would effectively sum that up?
I think so. Yeah. So for me, yes, honestly expressing myself through my work.
Okay, that's beautiful. Well, as we close our conversation out here, any other ideas that you want to leave our listeners with regards to this documentary family photography?
I mean, I think I didn't get to mention the principle of, mastery because, that has to be the root of what you do. Like you have to be intentional about learning your craft. And then, to finally sum it up, just I see this as, a contribution to like my family history and to other, family histories as to why it's, important to, even if you don't hire a documentary photographer, but to take on a kind of documentary approach when you're photographing your family. And it's not just if you have kids, it's, your parents, grandparents, your aunts, uncles. We want to be able to, just kind of have images that, kind of reflect our unique family dynamics. So,
yeah, mastery. I mean, you talked about earlier with your kids and wanting to just be champions off the bat, but it's a great reminder for all of us that it does take the work and not just putting the time in, but doing so consistently, because it's easy to be excited about something, put work in for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, maybe even a month or two. And then it just, the excitement wanes. And at that point, you have to go back to those kind of root level values and then big picture goals that are driving everything that you do, and let those just push you forward. The mastery is going to come from not only the time put in, but consistently putting the time in. And that's really important to remember. And then, remembering the significance of this legacy that we're passing on. There is something beautiful to what, I mean, not only you are giving to others as your clients, but something that you're doing for your own family as well. And I can't stress enough, for those of you listening in, make sure that you go follow Leslie on Instagram. And actually, Leslie, this is a great segue to my last question or just request for you. If you don't mind sharing with our listeners one more time where they can find you online, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate it. You can find me. My website is lesliekershaw.com. And I have 2 Instagram accounts. One of them is personal, Leslie Kershaw, and the other one is Leslie Kershaw Photo.
Perfect. We'll put those in the show notes. Thank you as well. This has been a lot of fun. In case you all listening in can't hear the energy in my voice, this has been a really, really fun conversation for me. Make sure that you go take a look at the show notes.
Nathan.
Show notes, Bokeh Podcast, BOKEH podcast.com. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Have a great day.
Bye, guys. Thanks for having me, Nathan.
Thank you so much for listening to the Bokeh Podcast. Will you let us know what you thought by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast and suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Bokeh Podcast is brought to you by Milu, the simplest way for photographers and coordinators to collaborate on shot lists and timelines for weddings, parties, and other amazing events. Visit Milu, MIILU.com. This podcast is also brought to you by Photographer's Edit, custom image editing for the professional photographer. Visit photographersedit.com.